Ukrainian crisis continues to deepen. Russia has probably significantly exceeded the threshold of 100,000 soldiers massed on the borders of Ukraine, and trains loaded with tanks and military equipment continue to come in what seems to be the preparation of a large-scale invasion. Although an analysis of the disposition of the forces that might face it shows a clear technical superiority of the Russian army, the outcome of a possible war is far from being anticipated. Russia can quickly get the occupation of some territories, but somehow it has to complete offensive operations on a horizon of a maximum of 1.5 months. Although this map suggests that Russian troops are arranged in such a way that they can quickly invade more than a third of Ukraine, including the capital Kiev, it is more likely that their first objective is to build the land bridge between Donbas and Crimea, the peninsula being, after the occupation in 2014, cut off from the water pipes built during the time of the USSR. In the event of an invasion, the Russian army has multiple tactical options. The official border between the two states is about 2,000 kilometers long, of which almost 400 kilometers are controlled by Moscow-backed separatist forces. To this is added another 60 kilometers in the Isthmus of Perekop, which connects Crimea to Ukraine. Ukraine still has almost 2,000 kilometers of coastline that are vulnerable to an amphibious invasion from Crimea, especially in the Azov Sea region and the city of Mariupol. Finally, the border between Belarus and Ukraine is 1,000 kilometers long. Depending on the objectives set by the Kremlin, these long borders can allow multiple axes of attack that will provide tactical flexibility to the Russians and will maximize the defense capacity as well as the logistics of the Ukrainian army. Among the main scenarios circulated in the west are an attack on Kiev through Belarus, a massive attack on eastern Ukraine up to the Dnieper, or an assault on the entire coastal zone to cut off Ukraine's access to the Black Sea. Starting from October-November 2021, Russia is still moving troops to the border with Ukraine, some of the military equipment being already deployed there as early as spring. Estimates show that between 90 and 175,000 Russian soldiers, divided into about 60 to 100 battle groups of battalion. Such a mixed unit consists of about 50 armored vehicles, including 10 tanks, and 600 to 800 soldiers and officers, about 200 infantrymen, the rest being artillerymen and soldiers who maneuver combat technique and other means of support. These battle groups are strung including in the area of the separatist regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, but also in Crimea, so that the opponent cannot predict whether the main attack will be carried out from the north, from Belarus, threatening Kiev, or from the south, in the direction of Donbas, Mariupol, Crimea. Numerically, the forces currently deployed by the Russian Federation on the western border now account for between a third and one-half of all active land armed forces. But about 40% of the soldiers of the Russian army are recruits within and not professional soldiers. It is not clear how many of them will be sent to the potential conflict zone. It is to be assumed that few. Among the units ready to enter the battle are parts of the 41st Army, units of the Airborne Forces, VDV, and at least one tank division, Kantemirovskaya, of the 1st Guard Army tanks, as well as self-propelled artillery units, medical units, anti-aircraft, drones and other support weapons. Moreover, journalists from Russia have discussed with relatives of soldiers deployed to Ukraine in recent weeks, also identifying the 155th Independent Naval Infantry Brigade in Vladivostok, the 14th Special Forces Brigade from Ussurisk, the Far East, and the 36th and 38th Motorized Infantry Brigades in the Transbaikal area. In addition, 6 frigates, a cruiser, 7 decent ships and 7 submarines are part of the Black Sea Fleet that will be ready to engage throughout the Ukrainian coast, up to Odessa. Another 3 decent ships are in transit from the Baltic Fleet to the Mediterranean Sea, passing on January 19 through the Netherlands. It is unclear what their final destination is and what their cargo is, but given the distance and the average speed of such ships, they could reach the Black Sea in 9 to 12 days. It is an additional sign that such an operation is increasingly likely. Later edit, the Russian Ministry of Defense now states that there are 6 decent ships in transit, not mandatory in the same convoy, and that they are heading to the Mediterranean for military exercises. At least 9 aviation units, Su-25, Su-30 and Su-34 bombers, as well as 3 helicopter units, Ka-52 Alligator, Mi-35 and Mi-8 Terminator, are also deployed in the area and can provide both tactical support and strategic bombardment on vital Ukrainian targets. That's, in total, at least 500 aircraft, a number comparable to that used by the US-led coalition in the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Missile units, such as the 119th Brigade, equipped with 9 K-79 Tochka missiles with a range of 180 kilometers, are also deployed for short and medium-range bombardment. They will probably be used to hit command centers, logistics, air defense units and other high-importance targets behind Ukrainian lines. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko had already declared on November 29, 2021, that in the event of war breaking out in Ukraine, Belarus would not stand by. The Belarusian 6th Tank Brigade has since been repositioned towards the Ukrainian border, officially to be part of a military exercise alongside Russian units. On January 17, Lukashenko suddenly announced that Belarus would hold new military exercises alongside Russia in February 2022. Only a few hours later, the first Russian military units were already crossing the border with Belarus. Given the time it takes to move a military unit, recalling personnel, preparing combat technique, providing means of transport, this very rapid movement indicates the previous training of Russian troops to enter Belarus in order to be able to directly threaten Kiev. Not necessarily to conquer it, but to force the Ukrainian army to keep defense units around it. Almost 70% of Russian forces are massed in southern and southeastern Ukraine. Crimea seems to play its most important role. According to an analysis by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, in early November, when the estimates were only 40 battle groups, they would have been divided as follows. 30% of the Russian forces are in the Crimean Peninsula, of which they would advance northwards, towards Mariupol and the bend of the Dnieper, joining the Donbas. Also from there, a marine descent force could disembark in Odessa, close to the border with the Republic of Moldova. 37.5% of the forces are deployed in the southeast of the border with Ukraine, near the separatist regions of Donbas, but also on the Ukrainian territory under the control of the separatists. 20% of the forces are in the northeast of the border with Ukraine and are expected to advance towards Kharkov in a southwest direction, with the possibility of cutting off the entire southern Ukraine. 10% of the forces are north of the border with Ukraine and Belarus and could advance towards Kiev, possibly together with the armed forces of Belarus. It is important to note, however, that the disposition of Russian troops and the Kremlin's intentions have been able to undergo significant changes in the past 2 months since the analysis carried out and published by the Ukrainians. On the other side of the border, the army of Ukraine has 250,000 active soldiers on its territory, to which will be added 900,000 reservists, already mobilized. Nominally, Ukraine has 144 aircraft, about 110 combat aircraft, mostly MiG-29 and Su-27, over 100 helicopters, of which only 35 Mi-24s, over 450 long-range anti-aircraft missile launchers, most of them of the S-300 type, as well as 400 short-range anti-aircraft launchers, Strela and Osa. The approximately 2,500 Ukrainian tanks, however, are mostly the T-64B, an outdated and technically much outdated model. Only part of them has been modernized. They are joined by 2,500 infantry fighting machines, BMP-1 and BMP-2, several thousand other armored vehicles, mostly amphibious carriers, 600 self-propelled rocket launchers, most of them BM-21, and about 1,000 pieces of self-propelled artillery, mostly 2S-1 and 2S-3. Ukraine has also bought Bayraktar TB2 attack drones from Turkey, much more than initially thought, but has also received significant amounts of military equipment. The United States alone has so far donated about 500 Javelin anti-tank missile launchers, plus British NLAW-type high-end anti-tank light tank missiles. On 17 and 18 January, Britain sent at least 7 flights to Kiev with this type of weaponry, which will probably be very useful in the event of a massive invasion against the Russian army's heavy armored vehicles. These days, the tone of the talks has undergone a drastic change, and Western countries have accelerated the supply of military equipment to Ukraine. Thus, the Baltic states received approval to transfer additional WEAPONS Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, howitzers to Ukraine. Moreover, an Antonov 225 aircraft of the Ukrainian aviation was scheduled to leave on the morning of January 20 from Montreal, with an unknown cargo. Canada was considering sending weapons to Ukraine as early as January 9. Russia-Ukraine Technical Military Report. The overwhelming majority of Ukrainian military equipment belonged to the Soviet Union, and the degree of operability and modernization is not exactly known. At the time of the invasion in 2014, few of Ukraine's military apparatuses were able to enter the fray. Subsequently, however, Ukraine invested significant sums in its armed forces, allocating about 4% of its GDP annually to them. The state-of-the-art equipment provided by NATO countries is of light caliber, but they will play a key role in the case of a well-coordinated tactic to inflict as many losses as possible on the Russian army. In addition to armaments, the US provided Ukraine with non-lethal equipment worth a total of $2.5 billion, consisting of radio equipment, anti-artillery radars, Humvee and Toyota Land Cruiser vehicles, Iveco trucks or reconnaissance drones. Although numerically, Ukraine will mobilize much more soldiers than the Russian Federation, in the event of a conflict, the Russian army has obvious technical advantages over the Ukrainian one. Of all, Russia's obvious air superiority is probably the most important. It is to be assumed that before exposing troops or armored vehicles, it will clear the sky, driving the Ukrainian Air Force out of the conflict zone. and will remove batteries and anti-air launchers from the fight with priority. Experts estimate that even drones bought from Turkey by Ukrainians will not pose a problem for the Russian Air Force, so it is to be assumed that the Ukrainian army will prefer to keep and protect them for a more advanced phase of the conflict. Russia also has significant advantage in the field of artillery and armored forces, and it is to be assumed that the units of the Ukrainian army will avoid direct confrontation with them so as not to be overwhelmed numerically and technically. However, there is a lot of controversy about the technical performance of Russian weapons. Few of the major Russian arms projects have come into operation. It is not clear, for example, whether or not Russia will use Sukhoi 57 aircraft, which have been officially in the endowment of its army for a year. This would have been the first model of invisible aircraft, but the development program was full of problems, and experts doubt that the plane is really operational. Other controversies were sparked by the new T-14 army tank, considered very technically advanced, autonomous turret, without crew, armor, etc., but which the Russians say has not yet entered series production. However, 4 to 5 such tanks have participated in the Red Square parades in recent years, and a real conflict could offer surprises. Possible deployment and the timing that military strategists will take into account. It is to be assumed that Russia will open an eventual invasion with its best equipped units, but if a lightning war fails, which will take the Ukrainian army out of the battle in a few days, the replacement vehicles will quickly deplete. And the Russian armed forces will have to resort to older equipment. On the other side of the front, Ukraine has an interest in causing the heaviest possible losses at any cost in order to affect both the morale of the troops and the support, however doubtful, of the Russian society thrown into a conflict whose necessity is not very obvious. A significant problem for the Russian army could also be the weather. This winter has so far been unusually warm in Ukraine, with temperatures that have dropped just below 0 degrees Celsius. Military operations in this area in wintertime need a well-frozen terrain, as Ukraine's road infrastructure is underdeveloped. The average temperature will cross above the freezing threshold in March, turning the entire land in eastern Ukraine into a sea of mud, the famous Rasputitsa, that will slow down or even prevent large troop movements and their supply. The weather therefore puts additional time pressure on the Russian army, which has at its disposal at most a month and a half to fill decisive positions. Any day of postponing the invasion is, by implication, an advantage for Ukraine. Another significant problem for Russia is the logistical effort to supply the troops. The Russian army is dependent on railway lines to supply its units. Russia and Ukraine have the same gauge of railway lines, but it is very likely that a significant part of them, as well as the bridges and large railway hubs, will be destroyed by the Ukrainian army in a possible withdrawal. This would force the Russian army to resort to trucks for supplies, and multiple NATO studies show that Russian battle groups have too small a number of trucks to successfully cope with the logistical needs of the units. In addition, the trucks have limited mobility compared to crawler units anyway, and will have significant difficulties in keeping up with them, especially if the campaign stretches until after March. In conclusion, while Russia will probably not attack Ukraine unless it is sure to achieve the Kremlin's goals, the constraints generated by the weather, the mobilization of the West and the military support provided to Ukraine are increasingly closing the window of time available to the Russian army. On the other hand, the costs of an invasion, both the economic ones, related to the money needed to dislodge the troops, and the diplomatic ones, related to the animosity that the Kremlin has already attracted, as well as the rhetoric used internally to justify a possible aggression, leave very little room for Vladimir Putin's return after this huge deployment. If he relinquishes the invasion without obtaining important concessions from the West, he will experience a significant political loss internally and will have nothing to compensate for the damage already caused to Russia by this crisis. Perhaps this is also the reason why, in last night's marathon conference, US President Joe Biden said at one point that Putin will enter Ukraine because he has to do something.